Morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, 30 April 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike this morning. Let's go ahead and get started with Inside the Beltway. So House Republicans have proposed amendments to this reconciliation budget bill we've been covering that will include levying fees on immigrants who claim asylum at the border or apply for a work permit if they're part of one of these temporary protected status programs. And these fees would also apply to immigrants paroled inside of the U.S. and permanent residents or citizens who sponsor immigrant minors. I think it's pretty clear that this is one of those signals that the Trump administration and Republicans are trying to send to potential illegal immigrants to disincentivize illegal immigration, because there has been, under the Biden administration, a major influx and illegal immigrants who would then claim asylum and get a likely multi-year wait inside of the United States while they wait for a court case to work out. And I think the Trump administration is trying to figure out ways to lessen that caseload on the immigration courts. Also in Congress, a bipartisan group of senators reintroduced the Shipbuilding and Harbor Infrastructure for Prosperity and Security for America Act, or the SHIPS Act. And the idea is that this act would help boost U.S. shipbuilding by levying port fees on ships owned or operated by countries of concern, which is really China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and also provide a 25% tax credit for shipyard investments. And Scott Bessent yesterday said that the U.S. is in contact with China, and it is up to China to make the first move to de-escalate this U.S.-China trade war. Something key that he said yesterday was that the Trump administration is leaving the option of escalation open. He said, I have the escalation ladder in my back pocket. And he said this also could include an embargo on Chinese imports. And from what I've seen over the last couple of weeks, China is signaling that it's not going to make the first move to de-escalate the U.S.-China trade war, and is actually attempting an economic containment strategy against the U.S. through a charm offensive in Southeast Asia and with Europe. I think in a similar sort of strategy as Bessent has outlined, as far as building up a trade wall around China. China appears to be trying to do the same thing to the United States. Based on statements that China has made about this trade war, I think there is an increased risk that the U.S.-China trade war will escalate to an embargo, because the Trump administration and China are both signaling that they're not going to back down. And I think they could reach an impasse on these tariff negotiations. China's officially said that they're not actually negotiating with the U.S., but Bessent and Trump have both said that at multiple levels that there have been some talks going on. So this is something I'm going to keep an eye out for how this goes, because there are, implications for the U.S. If China does enact any kind of tit for tat embargo, if that's where this goes. Because as we've pointed out before, there are some key imports that we get from China, especially pharmaceuticals, consumer goods, electronics, and they are also a major refiner of critical minerals. Let's move on to our roll-up items for today. Former Vice President Kamala Harris is scheduled to give a keynote speech in San Francisco today to a Democrat campaign group, and apparently she's planning to urge voters to push back on Trump administration economic policies. I think this is clearly Harris positioning for some kind of political run. There's been a lot of talk about her running for California governor or attempting another run for president in 2028, and she's been floating both. So I think this is going to be her attempt to try to get in on the 2028 presidential run. TSMC said they've begun construction on their third Arizona chip plant, and that they're working on speeding up production at their recently completed second plant. And then their first plant that they built in Arizona to build chips, they said that their production yield is now comparable to its Taiwan-based factories, which this is, I think, a good sign for U.S. access to advanced semiconductors, but potentially bad for water security in the West, because semiconductor fabrication plants require a lot of very purified water. And as we've talked about over the last at least year, the Colorado River Basin, which feeds into Arizona, and a lot of these western water sources are experiencing major droughts and water security issues that go beyond even the U.S. border. And then finally, on the domestic side, the American Clean Power Association said that battery manufacturers are building or expanding 25 battery plants in the U.S. currently, and they're estimating about $100 billion in investments by 2030. And they said this is a realistic goal for domestic U.S. battery production so long as there is a stable policy environment. And from what I've seen, U.S. batteries, which are not just for electric vehicles, there are many lithium-ion batteries throughout all kinds of consumer goods and in the grid, because they're talking about building what they call grid-scale storage, are going to be dependent on imports from China for at least the next year. But I think this is also pointing out something that a lot of businesses that are looking at reshoring or concerned about is that there's a lot of uncertainty and concerns over stability due to Trump's trade policies and the shock that it has sent through U.S. supply chains and the U.S. economy and the markets. So I think that this might be because this is not the only industry I've seen talking about reshoring supply chains. The automotive industry has been talking about it. A lot of other manufacturers, even though they have said that they're holding off due to uncertainty, they have been at least meeting and considering reshoring supply chains and mapping their supply chains since I think right after the election last year. I think this is an attempt to send a signal to the Trump administration that they just want some certainty in how Trump's manufacturing and trade policy will be going forward. And Jared, you could come on and take us through your roll-up items, please.
Absolutely. We're going to start over in France. They're looking to lead the European Union on taxing small parcels, as they call it, from China by starting a tax on them on every individual parcel that next year. Now, the French are explicitly saying this is to lead the EU because the EU cannot implement a union-wide version of this until 2028. And at that point, France will reduce their tax and just apply the European Union tax. So it looks like for the foreseeable future, China's going to have less and less opportunity to actually conduct small trade inside of the EU, and this does seem to mirror the de minimis taxes that we were talking about a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and this also to me is a sign. There's a lot of talk about from especially some European experts that I've seen that Europe there's a flirtation that they see between Europe and China of like maintaining the current order where China is leveraging a lot of its export power. But to me, this and some other things I've seen from some European policymakers points to that Europe seems to be coming on the U.S. side of this idea of building a trade wall around China.
Absolutely. We talked about it a little bit here and there, but the Europeans are very worried that all of the overcapacity issues that they're already experiencing will be exacerbated by China not being able to push product into the United States because it has to go somewhere. They think it may end up in Europe. And the U.S. is now leveling new sanctions against 6 entities and 6 individuals for shipping ballistic missile fuel from China to Iran. So we'll see another set of sanctions here. And the State Department claims that this is part of the latest maximum pressure campaign. This is very similar to the teapot refineries that we've covered before. And Chinese economists are saying that the 145% tariffs that the U.S. has leveled at China have caused, quote, worse than expected demand shock. And in response, the central government is only using the March stimulus package that they already had approved to target key areas to really stimulate those. But the economists are calling for bolder moves, basically more stimulus. I think that's probably going to play into Besant's plan about not allowing China to export out of a recession. And lastly, we're going to quickly talk about China commissioning a direct route from Peru's port of Chancay, which we've covered extensively, over to Canton. And the Chinese expect this to reduce shipping times to 30 days or less. I think at one point we covered that they managed a 23-day ship, which is very impressive. And they expect this to lower logistics costs by 20%. This is all fine and great, but it's 11,000 miles. This really subjects the Chinese to tyranny of distance for all of their critical needs, such as food from South America here. And no matter how they actually plot this route, it will have to go through contested waters in the event of a Pacific War. So I think this will largely be used as a negotiating tool by the United States. Basically, you shut it off and say, if you want this back, you need to come to the table.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to our warning items for today. And first, on the domestic side, there was a decision from the International Trade Commission yesterday that said that China is dumping what's called 2,4-D herbicide in the United States on U.S. markets. And the National Corn Growers Association said that this recent decision to levy anti-dumping tariffs on this herbicide is going to hurt U.S. farmers. And they said U.S. farmers will have to rely on a single domestic supplier. It's Corteva, which was the company that brought this dispute to the International Trade Commission, while already facing high input costs and low commodity prices that we've been talking about for a while now. Farmers, ag economists have warned for 6 months or more that the U.S. farm economy is either on the brink of or in a recession. And, this is really going to hit U.S. farmers for crops that are are heavily exported, like soybeans, wheat, corn, and sugarcane, who are already being squeezed by this U.S.-China trade war and high input costs, and they're probably going to be hit the hardest by these herbicide tariffs. This is one of those major imports from China that we have pointed out before that would be impacted by something like an embargo or disruption of supply chains from the Indo-Pacific. However, I have found that their ranchers also use this herbicide for pasture, so we could expect ranchers in the meat industry to also be hit by these higher input prices. And Jared, if you could come on and take us through your warning item for today.
Absolutely. We've been covering the Indo-Pakistani conflict that has cropped up in the last week, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio is going to try to de-escalate it. He's going to speak with his Pakistani and Indian counterparts no later than today, though he may have started yesterday. The State Department wasn't clear on that. They said absolutely no later than Wednesday. At the same time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is encouraging his other counterparts from other countries to also step in to help de-escalate. Now, all of this is on the backdrop of the Indian Prime Minister granting his military full operational freedom, using a quote here, full operational freedom in choosing the means, targets, and dates of India's retaliation. So basically, Indian military, do what you need to do, no matter what it is, you have pre-approval. That's a significant escalatory measure. At the same time, Pakistan's information minister is claiming that India is going to attack within the next 24 hours. So I think the main way this is going to affect, we were asked, I think it was last week, about will China and the U.S. do anything? From what I've seen so far, the U.S. is trying to take a much more active role by actually sending their foreign minister to try to de-escalate that, where the Chinese have just said, oh, we encourage restraint. Please be responsible. Do not escalate. Not actually taking an active role. Now, where this starts getting interesting is if Secretary Rubio manages to actually de-escalate this, that's actually a much greater achievement than the China-led Iran and Saudi normalization treaty that we covered a couple of years ago. This would give the U.S. peacemaker chops that frankly would undermine a lot of China's previous efforts to shift the world away from the United States, which would allow the United States to further isolate China in this trade war.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers for today. If you could tee up a few questions, Jared. So the first one from Ben T. Inflation ticks higher while jobs and GDP tick lower. Has Trump been right about Powell being behind the ball again, and will Powell cut rates? This is probably better as a Mike question.
Yep, we'll see.
But I have seen Trump yesterday during his 100 days rally in Michigan did start criticizing Powell again after coming out and saying that he wasn't going to fire Powell. I think as a signal to try to stabilize markets, especially people that are retreating out of the market and not going into treasuries. I haven't seen anything where Powell has signaled he's going to cut rates, but this is probably much more of Mike question. All right, let's move on to the next one, please. Griseo Nemo, between these new chip plants and the water cooling for AI data centers, do you foresee a major water shortage? I don't think in the short term. I think as more of this industrialization happens, especially in these western states where you're seeing like TSMC building these chip plants in Arizona, it could make the water problem worse. It was, I think, as recently as the end of 2023 or 2024, the beginning of 2024, that Lake Mead and Lake Powell were, the officials were warning that they were potentially going to hit dead pool levels, which means water flow downriver in the Colorado River Basin is cut off. So it doesn't just impact water availability, it also impacts agriculture, like drinking water, but agriculture and hydroelectric power. And there has been an ongoing drought in the West. I think that this is a contributing factor to long-term water shortages out west as a lot of this manufacturing comes online. And we talked about this 1944 water treaty yesterday. And Mexico and the Trump administration said that they have a plan for Mexico to make up for their shortfalls. I don't think that's possible. I think in the long term, Mexico's water security situation probably is not going to improve drastically enough for them to make up for those water shortfalls. And I think eventually we could end up in a diplomatic dispute with Mexico over water availability and also issues in the West, because they're still fighting over distribution in the Colorado River Basin. And that I think that agreement is up next year. And the Interior Department is trying to force them. Doug Bergam is basically trying to get them all in line to get a water sharing agreement done. I think as time goes on, there will possibly be less water to go around in the long run.
Hey, Robert, I've got a quick follow-up question for you on that. Do you know why these water-intensive manufacturing plants chose the West, which at least from the way that the river system appears to be distributed, the West seems a lot less seems to have a lot less abundant water, where everything east of the Mississippi, it's just nothing but river valleys over there. Why would they choose the drier spot?
Well, it's probably availability of big enough land to actually put these fabrication plants up. Tax breaks at the state level as well. I think Georgia has also been trying to get manufacturing going, for example, and they're not out west, obviously. Yeah. But I think it's just these were long-term plans put in place, and that's where they ended up due to state level tax breaks and the availability of land.
Okay.
All right, Ben T. Liberal Party candidate Mark Carney won Canada's election by 2%. Did Trump's rhetoric about Canada statehood just hand Carney the win? I've seen this talk a lot about how Trump is responsible basically for Pierre Poilievre losing. I disagree that Trump had such an impact on the Canadian election, only because if you look at the age demographics of who voted for Carney, it's very similar, I think, to the 2024 election here, where older Americans with more assets and more exposure to market volatility voted for Harris, and same for Carney. And I've been reading a lot of people who are knowledgeable about Canadian politics that this was really it. Yeah, like the older voters in Canada who broke for Carney majorly, when they were polled, I think it was like 55% said that they voted for Carney because they're concerned about Trump. They have to do something about Trump. But I think the real motivator here is probably the market volatility introduced by tariffs against Canada and Trump's trade policies that have motivated them to vote for somebody they see as an anti-Trump and somebody who would give them more stability. Because younger voters, I think, went with Poilievre a bit more than Carney, and the same thing happened with Trump versus Harris. And I think it has to do with exposure to market volatility and assets that are vulnerable to these shocks from Trump's trade and economic policies.
I was watching polling, and for those that remember, a couple of months ago, we had a whole piece about how the Liberals it looked like they were going to have an absolutely historic loss, something like over 100 seats lost. And if I remember right, I think it was the day that Trump started saying 51st state. You watch that go just invert. So at least in the polling numbers prior to the election, it did seem that Trump had an effect, to the extent that the initial shock followed by tariffs and tariff talks and all that. Um, I think it's statistically significant. Um, that said, it is still the Canadian election. You can still vote in your own interest, and we'll see how that shakes out.
Well, I think it's also because Trudeau dropped out. He was really the focus of a lot of the Canadian ire, like Canadian voter ire, was really focused on Trudeau as an individual. And when he was pushed out, basically, from what I understand, basically his cabinet pushed him out because they didn't like how he responded to the tariff threats from Trump. And him dropping out and Carney being put in effectively, because as far as I understand, Carney doesn't even hold a seat. He's not technically a member of parliament. He was voted in by the Liberal Party in parliament to replace Trudeau initially. And he's, as far as I understand, pretty popular among Canadian Liberals. Ben T, how do you assess the risk that souring U.S.-Canadian relations and Mark Carney's election win will result in Canada increasing trade relations with China, increase Chinese influence in Canada? I don't know how much more they could increase their influence,
right?
Because there was
that
thing we talked about a few weeks ago where there was a ethnic Chinese Liberal member of Parliament who, in Mandarin, directed his Chinese ethnic Chinese constituents to go after his ethnic Chinese conservative rival and turn them into the Chinese consulate for $1 million bounty. I don't, and as far as I understand, listening to Canadians talk about what their experience is with Chinese in Canada, like there's already a lot of Chinese influence. There's also that Canada's CIA released that report in like 2023 saying that basically like significant portions of both major parties are effectively compromised due to Chinese elite capture. I don't know how much more they could increase their influence without unfurling a PRC flag above the Canadian capital at this point.
Yeah, I think that this is a lot of talk to probably try to sway Trump. I don't think it's going to happen. Part of the reason for that is like, if we were to have somebody like Bessent in charge here, like actually in the executive seat, we could maybe see a similar talk of, oh, well, what's he going to do for it? Maybe he'll be anti-populist, but at the same time, there's a practical aspect to Carney. He is still a banker that has to make practical decisions, and the most practical decision is to ally yourself with the people that have 10 times your population, are next door to you, and you don't have a border with. Not to mention you have a shared cultural history with. The idea that they're going to switch to China. Sorry, Ben, not meaning to pick on you here, but particularly this, I think, is never going to happen for exactly the same reason this is vulnerable. You start shipping across that ocean, it's all going to get shut down, and you're going to bring the might of the American military onto you. And if you have no effective border to do that, that is an issue. It makes far more sense for them to, maybe push back on Trump just for internal appearances, but actually still work with them. Not to mention that Canada they are providing a secondary energy, a secondary energy, not grid, supply chain to the Asian allies in order to confront China. They're not going to switch to China.
Well, I think that's a really good point. So John Mearsheimer, one of my favorite international relations academics, he wrote this book called Why Leaders Lie. And in it, he makes a really good case for leaders on the domestic side for domestic signaling purposes lie. But on the international side, they do not. So this could be a situation where Carney is saying these things for domestic consumption while in discussions with the Trump administration, which has been trying to keep as tight a ship as possible. So it's difficult to get a really good, solid read on them, except for public statements. maybe they're negotiating with the Trump administration while telling the Canadian population, domestic population, that we could go to China. I think based on where a lot of these Asian countries around China and European leaders are saying that they're saying, oh, we could go with China too. I think that's also attempting to put some pressure on the Trump administration in negotiations. I think what we're likely to see is exactly what you said, Jared, is the Canada will look at the geographic proximity to them and say, well, we're not going to eschew one of our biggest trade partners that is on our doorstep for someone on the other side of the world that is, as a lot of these other European countries and Asian leaders are saying, is going to just start dumping goods on our markets because they're not going to the U.S. anymore, which is going to hurt their own economies. A lot of these economies are also export dependent.
Yeah. As a final point, just looking at the inverse, somebody that was peeled off of China in order to fall into the American sphere of influence, I think looking at Vietnam would probably be a good analogy. They share a land border. They know that they can be invaded by China. It didn't go well for China, but they know they can. And having a war on your border, even if you win, is still not good. It took decades of effort, and it's still not 100% certain that they're not on China's side. Like, they are moving away, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to get involved. Canada has much the same situation where it's, very integrated economically, very integrated for all of basically any grid. It would take an enormous amount of effort for China to peel them off.
All right. From Wayne T. Didn't I see Trump was to assign a water czar? I haven't seen that. From what I have seen, he has basically directed Doug Bergam, who's the Secretary of Interior, to put some pressure on these states over these water negotiations. I imagine he's also involved with some of the negotiations over that 1944 water sharing treaty with Mexico as well. So he's as close. He's probably as close to a water czar as I've seen Trump put out there. All right. Next question, please.
That is.
Well, I also see. Okay, yeah, from Bad Wabbit, we'll cover this real quick. She asked about I want to know more about this $1 million bounty. So I think it's pretty well known at this point that China has these secret police stations throughout North America and Europe and probably other places where the idea is they provide services like renewing Chinese driver's license and identification papers and passports. But in reality, they we'll get to the French farmer question next. I saw that too. In reality, they act as stations for Chinese intelligence, the Ministry of State Security, to roll up dissidents that are here in the United States. And there have even been cases of prosecutions. I think some of them have been dropped, of police officers here in the United States. I think two big ones in New York City, NYPD, two ethnic Chinese immigrant police officers were investigated for giving information to the New York secret Chinese police station. So in Canada, this wasn't covered by media very broadly. It was actually in a Mandarin language news outlet that I found it in. They had this liberal MP, a member of parliament, was it like a speech, a campaign rally or speaking event where he had a lot of ethnic Chinese constituents, voters, Canadian citizens show up, people who are naturalized, spoke Mandarin. He said this in Mandarin and said that his followers should go chase down his rival, who was also an ethnic Chinese member of parliament in the Conservative Party, and turn him into the Chinese consulate for $1 million bounty. This happened like in March, I think. And yeah, this was real. He even apologized. It didn't get a lot of traction in mainstream media, but this liberal MP even apologized, admitted that he said this. All right, and then I think Bad Wabbit said, so there's an issue with farmers in France. Suicide rate is 2 per day due to the authorities' impacts of laws, restrictions put on them. Do you see that affecting us in any way? As far as U.S. farmers, I would not be surprised to find out that economic pressures on especially smaller family-owned farms is having a similar effect. I think the big impact is more consolidation of these farms as they're hit on both ends by input costs and lower prices for commodities, export curbs from some of the big buyers of U.S. agricultural products like China. I think the effect on the U.S. is going to be more consolidation of these smaller farms, and they're going to be bought up by the bigger corporate farms. Goods coming from France. I'm not familiar. I'm not intimately familiar with what exact products we import from France. Some of them, like I saw this big argument about champagne or something, after these tariff things started coming out, but that's just a branding thing. There are equivalent products made here in the United States. They just buy because of French law and like the U.S. about like basically cooperating with that. They're not allowed to call it champagne. They call it like California champagne and stuff like that. Otherwise, I'm not sure. I'm not intimately familiar enough with French exports to know what kind of impacts that would have on the U.S. economy.
Yeah, same here. Basically, as any French export I can think of, whether it's wine, cheese, weapons. They're an enormous weapons exporter. We make all of our own. So, in fact, as far as weapons go, they're a competitor. We try not to buy French weapons.
All right. I think that'll do it for questions for today. We'll be back with you tomorrow morning at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.